hear me loud and clear. So thank you for the opportunity to give you an overview of the organization and the funding of the debt advice centers in Austria. First of all, maybe a few words about myself. As Dieter mentioned, my name is Clemens Mitterlehner. I'm the managing director of the umbrella organization of the debt advice centers in Austria. I'm a social worker and a social scientist, and I have myself worked as a counselor for 14 years in Austria. So to give you an overview, please, can you provide the slides for us?
Yes, no problem. I'll get them open now for you.
Okay. I was not sure if I should present the slides myself. But you could do this for me.
No problem. You should be able to see them now.
Okay, perfect. Yeah.
Okay, you just let me know when you want me to move on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you please switch to the second one? Okay, perfect. So I will give you an overview and about the topics I will talk about in the next minutes. I will give you some information about Austria, the federal states, and funding. There is a slide about social welfare legislation and the legal forms of organizations in the field of debt advice. I will talk about requirements for funding and the training and working as a debt counselor. A few words on funding of the umbrella organization, followed by special funding during Corona. And I will introduce our idea of a new concept of funding. I will show you some statistics and a few informations about additional offers and activities of the debt advice centers. So let me first mention a few general facts about the country of Austria. I think this is an important basis for discussing the financing of debt counseling in Austria later on. So the next slide, please. Austria has 9.1 million inhabitants. The only real big city is Vienna with 2 million inhabitants, and Graz, the second largest city in the south of Austria, has just 300,000 inhabitants. So typical metropolitan conditions are therefore only to be found in Vienna. For example, a significantly higher proportion of unemployment and immigration. Austria is divided into 9 federal states. Both in legislation and in administration, there is a very pronounced division of responsibility. Thus, the centrally relevant legal norms on insolvency and execution law are anchored in federal law. However, the operation and financing of the 10 debt advice centers is the responsibility of the federal states, which provide around 87% of their funds. I think it's a great advantage to have only 10 organizations running a debt advice center. We heard this morning about Germany with 1,400 agencies. In Austria, all 10 debt counseling centers are linked together in the umbrella organization. So we, as the umbrella organization, represent 100% of the organizations in the field and all the people working in these organizations. The following figures on funding and later on debt counseling clients actually cover 100% of the field of debt counseling in Austria. So the next slide, please. In 2022, a total of around 17.7 million euros was spent by governmental institutions on the debt advice centers and the associated prevention work. This means, as mentioned, 87% from the federal states, another 7% from the public employment service, especially in Vienna, and 6% from other institutions such as the chambers of labor or the chambers of commerce. On average, the public sector spends €1.90 per inhabitant per year in the debt advice centers. These figures reflect the total investment in the organizations. About 83% of the total funds are spent on counseling services for over-indebted people. Another 11% of the funding goes into financial education, and about 6% is funded for the operation of the so-called assisted bank account. This is a project to secure important expenses such as rent and energy. We have a study by the Vienna University of Economics and Business Administration that shows that every euro invested in the debt advice centers has a positive effect of €5.30 equivalent. This study on social return on investment certifies that the debt advice centers in Austria generates a very high social benefit. After this overview, I would like to explain in a more detailed way how the financing of individual counseling centers is organized. Then next slide, please. As I said, Austria consists of 9 federal states. Each state has its own social welfare law. Therefore, each province has different regulations on whether and how debt counseling is financial education is to be financed. One example is the federal state of Upper Austria. Here, the Social Welfare Act states that the province must ensure the provision of debt counseling and also financial education. The federal state finances 2 organizations that provide counseling and financial education throughout the province. The 2 organizations have concluded subsidy contracts with the local government and are financed on this basis. The contracts include performance aspects, such as the number of counseling sessions held. However, these institutions are independent organizations that are run as non-profit enterprises. In other federal states, debt counseling is not explicitly mentioned by law and is offered as a special form of general social counseling. There are also federal states where counseling for financial problems is not mentioned in the law at all. Next slide, please. As different as the legislation is, as different are the forms of companies in the field of debt counseling. The institutions in Upper Austria mentioned earlier are social associations. They have a voluntary board and a salaried managing director. In other provinces, for example, Vienna and Vorarlberg, the debt counseling services are integrated into larger institutions. These are large service providers in the social sector that also offer debt counseling as a service. The third model is the province of Burgenland, the smallest federal state in Austria. Here, the local government itself provides the counseling. The staff members are therefore employees of the federal state. There are also institutions that are organized as limited liability companies. Some also have non-profit status from a tax perspective. Next slide, please. All debt counseling services that are publicly funded in Austria have so-called state recognition. This is a requirement for public funding. The state recognition is a very important feature for the debt advice centers in Austria. You can see the sign with the eagle in the upper right corner on the slide. Only after fulfillment of defined legal criteria, an advice center can receive state recognition. As the umbrella organization, we have the right to give our opinion on this examination procedure. The characteristic of state recognition is intended to enable consumers to recognize public debt advice centers. In Austria, it happens again and again that commercial consultants try their hand on debt counseling, often with questionable methods and with moderate success. The criteria to get the state recognition are: the organization has to be non-profit oriented, the consultation has to be free of charge for the clients, there have to be at least 3 debt counselors full-time, the organization has to have at least 2 years of practical experience in debt counseling, and there has to be a quality management system. The existence of such a quality management system is therefore another important factor for debt counseling to be publicly financed. For more than 20 years, the 10 Austrian debt advice centers have been developing common quality standards. Since 2012, the advice centers have been audited according to the internationally recognized ISO 9001 certification. Let me mention a few of the essential criteria. Common quality standards are defined about the main process in debt counseling. There are guidelines on infrastructure and personal equipment. There has to be a defined knowledge management system. We have methods for measuring customer satisfaction. As the umbrella organization, we provide an Austria-wide complaint management system. All debt advice centers have got their system of risk analysis, and we define how to deal with errors and deviations. The audits are carried out annually by external certification agencies, and conformity with the standards is checked. As the umbrella organization, we have our own quality management system that regulates our core areas. The funding authorities must, of course, be provided with ongoing proof of the use of the funds. On the one hand, this is done at the level of the federal provinces. Each institution submits the agreed evidence to its own funding authority. On the other hand, there are Austria-wide statistics that we provide as an umbrella organization. Both together are proof of the correct use of funds to the funding authorities. At the same time, these statistics also serve as an important basis for political and governmental decision-making. Next slide, please. The staff plays a major role in both the state recognition and the quality management system. In Austria, we have 135 debt counselors calculated on a full-time basis. So on average, each debt counseling center has about 13.5 debt counselors. Of course, much more in Vienna with more than 40 and much less in the smaller provinces. In addition, we as the umbrella organization have 22 employees. The training to become a debt counselor is based on two main source professions. Most debt counselors are jurists, followed by social workers and other source professions. These include bank clerks, pedagogues, and various economic studies. This distribution between mainly jurists and social workers shows the orientation of debt counseling in Austria. It's an advisory service in the social sector, which has a very strong focus on legal advice. The social work approach, a systemic approach to counseling and social work interventions, have a high value in daily work. In my opinion, this is one of the success factors, which is why debt counseling is very successful in getting people out of over-indebtedness. A purely legal expertise is not sufficient. An essential point is the clearly defined training as a debt counselor. In Austria, it's not possible to learn the profession of debt counselor directly. First of all, one must be employed in one of the 10 state-recognized debt advice centers. This is done on the basis of the various professions I mentioned before. In addition to the intensive learning on the job, training takes place in 3 parts, each lasting 4 days during the first year of work. We call these training blocks Basics 1, 2, and 3. These include a broad spectrum of contents which are important in the daily work as a debt counselor. The curriculum contains the following areas: insolvency and execution law as the essential legal basis, the theory and the practice of debt settlement procedures, other important legal sources like the Banking Act, the Land Register, and parts of the civil law. The training is also about counseling know-how, for example, communication and perception, system thinking and interventions, reflection on one's own actions, and fundamentals of the negotiation discussion. After completion of these training blocks and 2 years of professional experience, the new debt counselors receive a certificate, which must be renewed every 3 years. The curriculum is constantly being developed by practitioners from the field of debt counseling, and most of the trainers are also experienced practitioners from the field of debt counseling. The training is organized by us as the umbrella organization. Next slide, please. In many of the aspects already mentioned, we as the umbrella organization play an important role. We are funded by the Ministry of Social Affairs and the Ministry of Justice for the coordination of quality management and also for the provision of debt counselor trainings. As the umbrella organization, we are the liaison office between the 10 debt advice centers. We network the activities. We take care of Austria-wide media relations. We are the common spokesperson for politics. We supply scientific findings. We carry out national and international projects, and we represent the topic of debt counseling internationally. There will be a separate workshop on the topic of umbrella organizations in June. However, since today's topic is funding, let me briefly mention the funding of the umbrella organization. The next slide, please. We fulfill the tasks mentioned before, and for this we receive basic funding from the Federal Ministry of Social Affairs. This year, for the first time, this is done on the basis of a 3-year contract. Before that, we were only funded yearly for individual projects, which often made planning difficult. In addition to our tasks as the umbrella organization, we are also very much involved in handling private bankruptcies. In about 30% of private bankruptcies in the so-called repayment procedure, we act as the settlement agency for the repayment period. This is usually 3 years, sometimes 5 years. We take the payments from the debtors and forward the money to the creditors. For this, we receive a fee of 15 euros per month and file. At present, we are in charge of about 6,500 files, which provides us with regular income. Although we operate as a business enterprise in the legal form of a limited liability company, any profits remain in the company. In this way, we drive projects forward and help finance our activities as an umbrella organization. All this is done in the spirit of our mission to reduce over-indebtedness among the population and to improve the situation of over-indebted people and those affected by poverty in society. I will be pleased to elaborate more on this in the workshop in June if you would like to participate in this workshop as well. Next slide, please. As in many other countries, there were special forms of funding to combat the consequences of Corona. In the context of this, a total of 1 million euros was used for 3 years to expand the counseling capacities of debt counseling. This was the first time ever that federal funds went to the debt counseling centers of the provinces. This would not have been possible without us as an umbrella organization. The Federal Ministry of Social Affairs funded us as the umbrella organization and instructed us to pass on the funds to the debt counseling centers. We passed on the funds according to a population key. Of course, the processing was and is an organizational challenge because on the one hand, we act as the responsible funding recipient for the ministry, and on the other hand, we are the funding provider for the 10 debt counseling centers. In concrete terms, this means that we have to make a funding settlement that covers 10 legal entities. We also have to record, document, and account for the salary data of 21 additional employees. Next slide, please. The debt counseling sector in Austria is very well organized and also well financed. However, the financing by the provinces results in regional differences in the provision of debt counseling services to the population. On average, there are 15 full-time debt counselors for 1 million inhabitants in Austria. However, this range is from 9 to 21, so it depends very much on which province one lives in, how well one is provided with debt counseling. This leads to long waiting times for an appointment in some regions. This disparity is also visible in other services. For example, the topic of financial education is very present in the provinces of Upper Austria and Vienna. In the province of Tyrol, the debt counseling center cannot offer financial education for budgetary reasons. Also, the supervised account mentioned before cannot be offered in all provinces. In Austria, many state tasks are transferred from the state government to the provinces through the so-called fiscal compensation system. As I mentioned earlier, this raises a number of problems. We have therefore considered an alternative financing concept, which I would like to explain briefly. Next slide, please. We know from other countries and other areas that financing systems are based on the principle that the causer pays for the problems that arise. For example, when tobacco taxes are used to finance health campaigns. We've worked out a financing concept for debt counseling that follows these ideas. In Austria, an amount of 34 billion euros of new loans was granted in 2022. This includes all different types of debt financing to households and consumers. According to our idea, 1 per mil of the credit amount would have to be paid as a tax. This tax is used to fund debt counseling. Here are a few examples. Someone finances his living room furnishings for 2,000 euros via a bank. There would be a tax of just 2 euros. Someone finances a car for 40,000 euros through finance leasing. There would be a tax of 40 euros. Someone buys a flat for 350,000 euros via a bank loan. There is a tax of 350 euros. I think these are manageable amounts compared to the amount of credit. With these taxes in return, everyone can be sure that he or she will get free advice in case of financial problems. It's a kind of a counseling insurance at a very low price. The tax could also be collected from the lenders. This could be promoted as responsible lending. The state could favor this by allowing the tax to be treated as a business expense, which reduces the company's tax. The sum of these taxes would then be split among the regional debt advice centers according to the number of inhabitants of the federal state. I think this financing system would have a number of advantages. The public purse would be significantly relieved. An increase in the volume of credit would also increase the resources available for debt counseling. The population would be provided with debt counseling more evenly, and the lenders could use this tax for a positive image. There are no concrete implementation steps yet, of course. It would be a complete system change in Austria. But it's good to have new ideas at hand when new opportunities open up. Let me round off with a few aspects of over-indebtedness in Austria. I think it might be interesting for you to learn something more about the general situation of over-indebtedness in my country. Next slide, please. Around 56,000 people were supported by the state-recognized debt advice centers in 2022. Approximately 19,000 people visited a debt advice center for the first time. The clients of the debt advice centers earn significantly less than the average of the population. The client's median income is 1,400 euros. By comparison, the median income of Austria's total population is around 2,200 euros. The most common reason for over-indebtedness is unemployment or a reduction in income. About 30% of our clients are affected. Unemployed persons are nearly 5 times more frequently represented in the debt advice centers than in the total population. In total, around 33% of our clients are unemployed and another 46% are employed. The second most common reason for over-indebtedness at around 23% is a poor handling with money, or in other words, the lack of financial education. Third most common reason at around 18% is the failure of self-employment. These people were owners of a business, and this has resulted in personal liability for debts. For 14% of our clients, the over-indebtedness is due to Corona, for example, an illness or the loss of the job. The average amount of debt of our clients is about 61,000 euros. However, it must be said that extreme values of less than 1,000 and more than 700,000 euros were excluded from this calculation. Persons who have run a company have almost twice as much debt. The level of debt also increases with age. This means that the older a client is at the initial consultation, the higher his or her debts are. Next slide, please. Since the introduction of personal bankruptcy in Austria in 1995, there have been some up and down trends. Until around 2012, there was a steady increase. From that point on, fewer and fewer people managed to comply with the strict conditions of bankruptcy. Especially the minimum repayment rate of 10% was not achievable for many. As a consequence, many people were excluded from debt settlement. At the end of the year 2017, new regulations came into force and the minimum quota of 10% was removed. As a result, many people were able to catch up with their debt settlement and we reached a peak in the following year. As in many countries, there were sharp declines in insolvencies in the Corona years for various reasons. In 2022, the level of bankruptcies is approaching a pre-Corona level. Unfortunately, current inflation is pushing up the numbers of bankruptcies, and we are afraid that we will reach the peak of 10,000 bankruptcies again this or next year. The last slide, please. Here I would like to give you an overview of other services of the debt advice centers in Austria that are covered by public funds. The budget consulting is an additional service by the Austrian debt advice centers. This is aimed at people who are not over-indebted and who are undergoing change. For example, when a new job is accepted, when a child is born, when a house is planned to be built, or when retirement is imminent. This offer, which is also free of charge, is not about settling existing debts. It's about going into changed life situations with a plan in order to prevent debts and over-indebtedness. In some federal states, there are also projects with voluntary helpers. Over-indebted people are supported during the repayment period of the private bankruptcy. After the residual debt clearance, the people are supported to remain debt-free and to make no new debts. Reference budgets show the necessary monthly household expenditure for different household types. They serve as a guide in debt counseling and the discussion of social political measures. We first developed reference budgets in Austria 2009 and have updated them annually since then. The purpose of drawing up reference budgets is to calculate the actual costs of a basic standard of living and enables him or her to participate in social life. So it's not a question of calculating how much money is needed just to survive. It's about showing what a decent life costs, which includes social and cultural participation. The reference budgets are therefore not only an important tool to fight poverty and over-indebtedness, they also help to prevent social exclusion and reduce social inequalities. Throughout Austria, there are various services in the field of financial education offered by the debt advice centers. These services are, for example, workshops in schools, e-learning courses, and concepts for school lessons directed at teachers. Since the 1990s, over 375,000 people, mostly children and young adults, have been reached face-to-face with the various financial education services offered by debt advice centers. From our point of view, it is essential to discuss basic questions about money with young people. Recently, we have heard more and more from banks and financial service providers that financial education is needed to strengthen the capital market. Of course, it's also important to be able to distinguish between stocks and bonds, for example. But first, you have to understand the basics. That is very important to us in our financial education. So thank you. That was all from me, and you can contact me every time when you have further questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Clemens, for this very intriguing presentation. I liked especially your ideas, thoughts, and studies about the return of investment